So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's discussion. Today, we're going to be focused on the latest report that was issued by European regulator EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. This report is intended to summarize good ESG practices, particularly focused on how to integrate ESG into business models. Thrilled to be joined today by our client, ABN AMRO. We have Tjeerd Krumpelman, who is the Global Head of Advisory, Reporting and Engagement of the Group Sustainability team over at ABN AMRO. And we also have his colleague, Catalina Hemmick, who is the Sustainability Specialist. Thanks for joining us. I'm also joined by my colleague, Donato Colace, who is a member of the EFRAG task force. So he can provide some insider knowledge to us today as we go through the key report highlights. But before we get into the meat of the discussion, I just wanted to go over what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about the report. We're lucky to hear from ABN AMRO about how they are linking ESG to their business model. They were featured within the report as a best practice company. And then we're actually going to go through a practical demonstration of how you can use technology to achieve the approach that's noted as best practice in terms of risk identification and monitoring in the report itself. Before we dive in, quick note on housekeeping. We are welcoming you to be interactive during this discussion. You are muted for audio quality purposes, but we do have a Q&A box. We have a chat box. Please feel free to use that throughout the discussion. If you have any technical difficulties, I unfortunately cannot help you, but my colleagues on the back end can. So just chat us on Zoom or email us at marketing@datamaran.com. If we have technical difficulties, please bear with us. We are recording this event, so we will send through the recording in about a week's time. Now, for those of you joining us and who may not be familiar with Datamaran, why are we here? Why are we having this discussion? Datamaran is a software analytics platform that companies like ABN AMRO use for a data-driven approach to ESG materiality and risk monitoring. It's the only software analytic platform in the world that identifies and monitors external risks, including ESG. As you'll see in the demonstration, we go beyond what is known as traditional ESG. And the offering is fully automated, so companies can use this in-house as needed to gain market intelligence on their ESG risks and opportunities. In addition to ABN AMRO, we work with a variety of companies. So as you'll see in the demo, the insights are applicable really to any company operating in any sector or any geography. But we also work with other service providers and law firms such as EY, DLA Piper, ERM, and today we just announced a new collaboration with Deloitte that's using our platform for sustainability assurance purposes. So the way that Datamaran works, and you'll see this at the end, is it's really about providing this continuous process by which you can make materiality more of a strategic decision-making process rather than it be simply a reporting exercise. And then through that process, what you're able to do is essentially get more information to communicate up to the board, to communicate into your annual disclosures, standalone ESG reports, financial reports, 10K filings, as we see the SEC is putting more attention to that. But also, since it is really this dynamic process, you can identify emerging issues and be a bit ahead of the curve to see, what's coming down the pike. Where is the puck moving when we think about policy making, when we think about what are the industry trends? And we'll go into that in a little bit. But the reason why we're hosting this, of course, is my colleague is part of EFRAG. ABN AMRO is a leading company, but the report itself, what was quite unprecedented is talking about how crucial the role of technology is in driving good ESG practices. So before I pass it on to my colleague, Donato, we'd like to hear from you. We have a few polls throughout the discussion. The first of which is, how would you rate your organization's ability to identify ESG risks and opportunities? 3 options here. First is solid and comprehensive. 2, it can be improved. 3, we have yet to start. So we'll give you about 30 seconds to respond to that. Just want to hear where you all are and where you're coming from. All right, we have quite a few results coming in. And they're changing still, but I'm going to end that poll and I will show the results. Great. So it looks like the majority of you say that it can be improved. Makes sense since you're joining us for today's discussion. So our hope at the end of this is that you have some practical takeaways that you can really bring home to your own organization to improve those processes. So with that, I am going to pass it on to my colleague Donato, who will walk us through the EFRAG report and some key takeaways that you can take home with you.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you very much. And good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining today. So it's great to see that many think that their processes to identify ESG risk and opportunities can be improved. I mean, the scope of the report that and the research that we did within our EFRAG task force was exactly that. So starting from the beginning, what sort of deliverables we generated? You can find online, and we can circulate the link to that. A main report, which is essentially the main document with all the indications and recommendations from EFRAG. A supplementary document that is very rich and long, that essentially deep dives into the details of the best practices. So for those of you that are really working on the identification of risk and opportunities, I recommend looking at that supplementary documentation. And finally, a summary for everyone else that is interested in those developments, but don't have the time to actually deep dive in the analysis. On top of that, there are also podcasts that summarize the content of the research, and there will be another EFRAG webinar on the 3rd of November. So plenty of opportunity to learn more about this. And if we go to the next slide, I'm also happy, of course, to share with you the highlights from the report. I'll keep it short, so we have actually the opportunity to hear directly from our clients, ABN AMRO, directly, how they are putting in practice the recommendations and being recognized as a leader. In terms of the work that we've done, we reviewed more than 44 companies, and the idea wasn't creating really a rating, but look out for those examples that really can be illuminating for the others. This allowed us to put together 7 steps for a path to improvement of reporting practices. And if we go to the next slide, let's deep dive into the highlights of the report. So of course, we started our analysis looking a bit what are the limitations in the current reporting practices, and I summarized the ones that I find most illuminating. Actually, there are many. I mean, it's not surprise. We hear it every day. Like ESG reporting is not perfect. It lacks some reliability. It's not at the same level of financial reporting yet, but we need to get there, right? So understanding what is missing, it's a crucial step in that sense. So the main points here concern essentially the fact that reporting on how business model works and the impacts that business model have on environment and society and the dependencies they have on the different capitals is not really holistically developed. So it's not consistent. It doesn't have enough detail in that sense. And when it comes specifically to identifications of sustainability risks, that is really still lacking in most of the cases. In particular, we identified inconsistencies in the fact that there is no alignment across the different reporting channels of what are these sustainability risks and opportunities, conversely. Like to give you a real story, I'm in the judging commission of a integrated report prize award in Italy, and I was assessing one of the integrated reports yesterday. I won't make names, of course, but this company identified sustainability risks, and they identified 4 risk factors associated with sustainability risks. And they also had a materiality assessment. And the materiality assessment was identifying 13 material issues. Now, how they went from 13 material issues to 4 sustainability risks, that it's really unclear. So that lack of alignment between what is identified as material and what becomes and what gets into the risk register, it's really a limitation of current reporting practices, which also leads, to the fact that most of the statements in the reports are really qualitative and non-substantiated with data and evidence. And of course, there is not yet, the deployment or the level of deployment of technology that it's really needed to achieve this quality of reporting. And in that sense, if we go to the next slide, what we did and what you can find within the report is a practical framework. So essentially, you can't judge the quality of a report without a framework. So the task force looked at different guidelines and standards existing, looking both at financial accounting, but also non-financial accounting, to identify what are the characteristics of good disclosure. Now, I won't go in detail in this, it's really accounting and technical, but the key takeaway that I wanted to share with you is it's also that if we go to the next slide, we did an analysis of how technology and different technological solutions can help achieve these different attributes that demonstrate good quality of disclosure. So from blockchain to satellite imagery, XBRL, multimedia reporting, data management, and artificial intelligence, you can see what are the technologies that drive those good features, good characteristics of disclosure. And well, some technologies are more flexible than others, like AI is an incredibly broad domain. That's why, as you can see here in this graph, it can ensure different characteristics of good disclosure. But our hope is that these analysis can also help practitioners, reporters, to decide the allocation of resources when it comes to planning their reporting activities and so on. In the end, let's keep in mind that if the goal is to achieve the same level of robustness between financial reporting and non-financial reporting or sustainability reporting, well, similar resources must be allocated to the two activities, right? Let's get to the next slide. And so this is an example of what you can find in the supplementary documentation, and it's a nice introduction also to Catalina and Tiered. ABN AMRO has been featured as best practice in the report. So what you can find in the supplementary documentation is essentially the disclosure coming right from the report that ABN AMRO published, or other companies as well, with some comments from the EFRAG task force explaining why this is a good reporting practices. What are the suggestions for improvements as well? So everybody can learn and can try to put these recommendations in place. One last consideration before passing back to Susie and Tiered and Catalina, if we go to the next slide, is that these developments are, of course, coming from EFRAG, which is a European body. But what we see in policy is that really there is a global international trend in that sense. And we're going to see even more of that next week, after COP26. But just to give you an example, earlier this year, it was clear from some statements of the US SEC that mandatory disclosure requirements on climate risk are coming up. And there is also this very interesting template letter that the SEC circulated, essentially denotes what we said before, the fact that if you identify ESG risks in your voluntary disclosure, like your sustainability report, but you're not addressing them in your financial statements or your SEC 10K filing, then the SEC is going to ask you, why is that? So the expectation is that there is more alignment between financial risk, financial reporting, and also non-financial or ESG reporting. So what's happening in Europe in one way could be something that we could see soon in other jurisdictions, and we're already seeing in other jurisdictions in different forms.
Absolutely. Great. All right. Thanks, Donato. And it sounds like your baby girl also wanted to participate in today's webinar. Before we jump into the discussion with Tjeerd and Catalina, another question for you, the audience. Are you currently including ESG factors in your risk register or your risk watch list? And you have 3 answers. Yes, we just started that process, or no. Give you some time. And to your point, Donato, in light of the growing policymaking and emphasis on materiality and disclosure, what we're seeing is that there's a need for integration of processes, including ESG, risk, financial analysis. So lots of departments are now getting involved. All right, let's end that poll. And it looks like we've got a relatively even split between yes and we just started that process. So definitely something that will be emerging more. Great. So let's get into the conversation with ABN AMRO, with Tjeerd and Catalina. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Great to be here.
Yes, happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Start off with a question for you, Catalina. Before assessing ESG impacts, you really need to know which material issues are most relevant to your organization. So how do you go about doing that?
Right. Good question. Well, as value creation is part of our strategy, it's very important for us to determine our material topics. And since we apply the broader integrated reporting framework to determine our material topics, we've decided to call them value creation topics, value creating topics, where we both include financial as well as non-financial topics. And then we start with determining a long list based on external and internal analysis, which takes quite a long time. We use Datamaran in this step to determine the completeness of the topics, as well as to see what our peers are doing and what regulation is doing. So we're using Datamaran there as an input. The next step then is to go from a long list to a short list. So we rank the topics that were featured in most of the sources that we used. And then the short list is a list of 36 value creating topics. And then we ask our external stakeholders to see what they think, which topics to them are most material for our organization. And we do that by sending out surveys to our 4 stakeholder groups. So we have customers, society, employees, and investors. So we make sure that all stakeholders are included in the analysis. And then the next step is to ask our internal board, our board of directors, and the group below that, so our executive committee, and see which topics to them are most value creating for our organization. So we then get the matrix, as we all know it, with the ranking of the topics. Then we link it to our strategy. So we have 3 pillars in our strategy, and we see which topics link to which strategy best, and then we present it to our executive board and ask them for approval. So the first step is really to identify the most value creating topics. And then we use it as a management tool and track the progress on the topics and drive that back into the organization.
Great. Great. So it sounds like it's a pretty robust process, a consistent process, and one that you do on a regular basis.
Yeah, we do it every 2 years. It takes quite a few times, so it takes us a few months to complete it. In between the years, so every other year, we do a pulse check. And that's also where we use Datamaran to see which topics are emerging. So that's really helpful. And for example, I did it a few months ago with my colleagues, and we identified that based on the regulations that are coming up, that biodiversity is actually an upcoming topic. So that really helped us to identify that, so we can include that and feed that back into the organization as well.
Yeah, makes sense in light of the focus on climate change and the role that
Exactly.
financial services can play there. Great. So then, Tjeerd, taking that process and thinking more about the impacts, how do you actually go about considering what the impacts are on your business model? And how are you using the insights that you gain from that materiality process and those ongoing pulse checks to really drive more value beyond reporting?
Yeah, and this is where the starting point can be materiality and aligning. I like the example that Donato shared on aligning materiality and ESG risks from a risk perspective, but also applying materiality to your business model. So looking at banking and looking at the specifics of our bank, you can really use your value creating topics to align it with your business model and to see where you create most impact. And then it's good to be aware that these impacts can be either positive or negative, right? So a lot of the stuff that we do create negative impact, either on carbon or biodiversity or on other ESG related topics. And by being aware of that and having a plan to reduce or to minimize negative impacts as much as you can, and at the same time improving your positive impacts, that's how we believe materiality can truly feed into value creation, and value creation can lead into decision making, and that can lead into making the right decisions and creating a true impact or a true delta on impact. And a lot of this final stuff is still, it's still work in progress. It's not an automated system. We need to think about it. We need to discuss it. But there is value in that debate as well. It's extremely interesting to have a discussion, like Catalina mentioned, at board level, that discussion is being led by hard data. So these are the material topics, or this is what we found from our stakeholder research. But then entering into a conversation around impact, value creation, and business models. And of course embedding that into your strategy. If you take a little time to plan and to really guide that discussion in a proper manner, the outcomes can be truly interesting to guide your company. Not only using it for reporting. I know there's a purpose to reporting, and we have to comply, and and it's great that EFRAG has some best practices on disclosures. But what would be really interesting if behind those disclosures is actually a firm process on value creation, impact, and materiality as a tool to deliver on that. So I'm always interested in the processes behind it and the discussions that were led. And in some great integrated reports or in some great disclosures, you see a little bit, you can peek into the kitchen on what they have done. And this is what we are trying to achieve within ABN AMRO as well.
Great. And to your point, data is king to drive discussions, to back things up, to validate, to justify. But on your final point around impacts, that's also why we're seeing an emphasis on double materiality in Europe right now, basically, which I think, you've been doing for quite some time now, is really considering what are both the financial impacts of issues on our company, but also what is the impact of our company on the wider stakeholder group.
And of course, being in banking, and I know this applies to other sectors as well, but I don't think there's a sector where it applies as much as in the financial sector, right? So our impact is by and large created outside our own operations. So it's good that we are aware of that, and obviously we are.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. You can both be a provider of sustainability-oriented services, which can only drive and accelerate change. Great. And in terms of that ongoing pulse check and looking at emerging issues, I think a question is, okay, so we have the data to show that something's emerging. Now, what do we do about it? So maybe you want to just explain a little bit about that, and then we can dive into the platform and continue the conversation.
Sure. Well, the pulse check, so like I explained, it definitely helps us to identify emerging issues, which is interesting because it also helps us to look forward to next year when we'll be doing the assessment again based on double materiality and take the next step. But for example, identifying biodiversity now as an emerging issue will help us to already look at the topic and see how our organization has impact on biodiversity and what we can do about that. So I think based on the impact assessments that we've been doing for a few years now, we've already had a little peek at where our impact lies, and I'm sure biodiversity was also included in there. But it just it confirms again that it's upcoming, that we need to look at it, and it helps us to already see what we could do. Looking forward to next year, and then hopefully share that with our colleagues as well. So based on the material topics that we identified, we created a value creation community where we identify one colleague in the organization as a process owner for each topic. So that helps us in having the discussions with these colleagues, bringing the topics wider into the organization and involving them in the process, and see where we can add more value and go from there.
Yeah, maybe to add just briefly on the relevance of having a high quality process to determine materiality, right? So it's not only because it improves, well, there's two reasons. One is that it improves the outcome, right? It makes it a better materiality analysis if you have a robust data-driven process. But the other effect is, and that is more an internal process, it improves credibility of the outcome. So it's less challenged if you have a robust process that these are the material or value creating topics for your company. And that's why we decided a couple of years ago that we wanted reasonable assurance on the process of determining our value creating topics. And now that's not something that is mandatory or that anyone is asking of us, but we found that it improved the process, so that's helpful. It improved therefore the outcome of the process, but the biggest win for us, and it was a little bit of a surprise, not a total surprise, but it was a little bit of a surprise, that it also improved internal credibility of the outcome. And that's been saving us a lot of time on debates. How did you get to these list of material topics or value creating topics? This is how we got to the list. The process has received reasonable assurance. It has been validated by EY in our case. And this is how we run that program, and that's been really helpful. So I wouldn't recommend it to do it in your first year of materiality analysis, but somewhere in the journey, please include some form of assurance on it.
Absolutely, and we're seeing more emphasis on assurance as well. So that's actually a good transition. Now I will start sharing my screen, and let's make this practical, walk through technology and really show how you can go through this process and have that data, to your point here, to back up decision making and justify why you're investing in and prioritizing certain issues. So I hope everyone can see my screen. What I've pulled up now is the Datamaran platform. So as I mentioned, Datamaran is really about supporting this data-driven process for materiality and risk monitoring. It is dynamic. So here you're seeing a snapshot in time, but I'll show you some of the more dynamic elements of Datamaran as well. And what you'll see here, I'm using a demo that's looking at the banking industry in the United States. And the first view is this matrix, which I believe is quite familiar to most people in the industry. But how did we get here? How did we get to this matrix? Essentially, what you see on the vertical axes is giving you the relative priority of these issues according to different external stakeholder inputs. And this is speaking to the sources that Datamaran assesses. So we look at corporate reporting, sustainability reports, financial reports, 10K filings, to really provide a proxy of, what are the key issues in an industry, amongst your peers, amongst your customers, for instance. What are some of those more, competitive risks and opportunities? We further validate what we see there with what is happening in regulation and policy making. So Datamaran has the most comprehensive collection of both hard law, but also, and most importantly in this space, soft norms, voluntary initiatives that impact corporate disclosure and strategy on these issues. So here you can really see, what are the issues that are being prioritized by regulators and policymakers. And that policymaking piece gives you that window into where's the puck moving when it comes to policymaking? How can we prepare and be proactive versus reactive? And then the third piece to further triangulate and validate this information is looking at media. And that's really providing more a proxy of public opinion. So again, you can get that insight into what's emerging. Media, of course, is one input to what's emerging. Media can change, but if you collate that with the other inputs that we're looking at, then you can really validate something is not just emerging at a moment in time, but it's emerging consistently over time. And then on the horizontal axes, that's typically populated to represent the priorities of the company. To Catalina's point, you can populate that through surveys, you can populate it through custom data uploads reflecting stakeholder engagements you've had. We have companies who also populate it by relying on a Datamaran analysis of their latest disclosures as a proxy. But let's go beyond the matrix. And one thing to specify, you are in control of the criteria informing your analysis, so this can be customized to your company. What's interesting here on this, based on this analysis, is you can see that there are some topics where we would say there are some gaps here. There are issues that we see as significant from that external viewpoint, but perhaps the company does not yet invest enough in that issue or isn't prioritizing it in the right way. So let's zoom in on a particular issue, looking at, for instance, access and affordability. If we click into the issue, this is where you get some of that more contextual data to really, to Catalina and Thier's point, back up decision-making and engage in those conversations across the company. The first is essentially just showing you, what is that discrepancy in ranking according to that external viewpoint and how your company looks at the issue. But more importantly, to again, guide strategy and decision-making, what you're able to see here is how does that issue rank across the different stakeholders you've included in the analysis. So that helps to answer, where is this information coming from? Who might be the appropriate owner of this issue for the time being in the company? And what are we going to do about it? How are we going to approach that? So you can see that this is an issue that's being driven by media, industries and peers, regulators, policymakers. And you have another viewpoint down here, a graph to show you what that looks like. So a lot of our clients will take these graphs, plug them into presentations for those ongoing pulse checks, executive council meetings, board meetings. And you might be saying, when we talk about access and affordability, what are we talking about? Here, we're really talking about issues that are related to social inclusion, inclusive products and services, financial access, responsible pricing. And what you're able to do is actually see that breakdown of the issue here. And in addition to seeing the breakdown of the issue and all of the underlying factors, so you know specifically what should we be focusing on when we talk about things like financial access, or when we talk about things like social inclusion, you'll also see any relevant GRI or SASB standard is available there to help give additional guidance on what might you want to disclose, what are the accounting metrics. The next question that you might have is, okay, so what are the issues that really present a higher financial impact on our company, that double materiality approach that we were talking about? And this is something that will be mandated with the upcoming EU sustainability standards. So 50,000 companies are going to be required to take a double materiality approach. This is a new feature that we've developed to facilitate that process, where you can essentially take a different lens and look at what are the issues that really present a higher financial impact. And here, what we can see, again, looking at the banking industry in the US, are those top issues, the ones that we would say present a greater financial impact on the company. The way that we go about that is looking again at the source data that we analyze as proxies. If you're interested in learning more about that methodology, happy to chat about that offline. But here, this graph is aimed to facilitate that process. Again, give you something that you can talk about internally, look at, and then, of course, compare that with what are the issues that have a greater impact from that wider impact on perspective. And we can see that, the order of issues there changes quite significantly when we look at the wider impact versus financial impact. So the next question may be, okay, now that we've identified our material issues, what are the key risk categories? What are the key risk drivers? And that's where you can go into the executive dashboard and start to get some of that deeper risk insight. The first thing that you'll see here is a gap analysis. So this is an automated analysis. Again, I'm using a demo here. But if this were your company using the platform, what this provides is a gap analysis. So here we're using your latest 10K or equivalent financial report to basically identify where are the biggest gaps in terms of what you are publicly disclosing as your key material risks or opportunities. Again, using that as a proxy, but it's a starting point. So essentially what you're able to see here is in the action required section those are issues that present a high likelihood of risk or opportunity for your company. Some issues we don't see you're currently addressing within your 10K or financial report. Some we see you're addressing, but you may need to revisit and reevaluate. And another one here that you'll see is access and affordability has this little icon next to it. What does that mean? That icon is telling you that over the past 3 months, the velocity around this issue has increased. It's positive velocity. So let's unpack that a little bit more. Again, what are we going to do about this issue? What are the key risk categories? How do we address this? The first thing you'll see is this risk scorecard where we provide an indication as to what's the likelihood of this issue presenting a risk or opportunity. And you can see that we evaluate that as high or low. What's the impact? Similarly, high or low. What's the velocity? And again, that's looking at movement over the past 3 months. So it gets to that dynamic piece. And as noted earlier, that's positive. One thing I do have to say is underlying all of this data, you do have access to the source data and the raw data. So if your risk team wants to take the numerical values that we're looking at here and plug that into their risk models, that is something that our clients are doing. Here, the disclosure diagnostics, again, because I have a demo, we don't see anything indicated here, but if this were your company, what you can do with this information is essentially say, okay, we're partially addressing the issue within our 10K or financial report, but actually we've done a lot around this issue otherwise, and we disclose a lot of information on that issue in our standalone ESG or sustainability report. So is this something that could be a low-hanging fruit opportunity for us to address? And then you start to ask the question, okay, so how are we going to address this? Where should we get started? So here you'll see the key risk drivers. And essentially what that will do is look at, again, what are the different categories of risks and what's really driving that? So you can see the breakdown that this issue presents, a relatively even split from a reputation standpoint, a competitive standpoint, a short-term regulatory risk standpoint. There are also long-term regulatory risk implications. So you might want to go in and start to get some deeper information to answer those questions of what do we do about this. If you click into short-term regulatory risks as an example, you'll be able to see all of the different regulations that are relevant for you to address and take into consideration. So as mentioned, transparent audit trail, you have access to the source data, and then you can click into these initiatives to get a top level summary of what they entail, links to the official source, and an overview of any other related initiatives that you may need to take into consideration. You may be asking, when we talk about competitive risk, what are we looking at here? And this is where you can get that benchmarking data that we know boards and executives really value and appreciate. So here, essentially what you're able to do is compare where you sit on a particular issue in relation to your top competitors, any company of interest, really. We track about 8,000 companies globally. And you're able to see here, okay, in comparison to some of my top competitors, I might be lagging, I might be leading, or hey, I see that Citigroup is leading on this issue. How are they addressing that? Where are they addressing that? And then what you can actually do is go into the source data to see exactly where within the report they talk about that and how they do that, to get some more of that inspiration to see where their disclosure is and what KPIs they might have. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to end on monitoring. So as we mentioned, there are emerging issues. Catalina, Tiered, you're doing ongoing pulse checks. This dashboard facilitates that process by which within any time frame, in this case, I'm looking over the past year, but you could look 1 month, 3 months, you can see how these issues move and whether or not they're increasing in likelihood. So first off, the top risks, those that have moved the most in terms of likelihood, will be highlighted for you. But really, you can look across all risks. And here we can see that transition to renewables and alternative energies is something that increased. Climate change, something that increased. Public health risks. And then you want to answer the question again, why? When you click into that issue, you'll know exactly what's driving that. And in this case, we can see that there's been increased regulation around this issue, and that's what's driving the likelihood of this risk to change. Now, I appreciate we're running close on time. If you're interested in learning more about this process, feel free to contact our team. But with that, I do want to stop sharing this, and I do want to open up for Q&A with the audience. I do see we've had some questions put into the Q&A box. I'll check the chat box. All right. So there's a question here about integrated reporting in South Africa. And we see that the companies have gotten the message of aligning a discussion of key risks with listing of key material topics. But companies have concerns about disclosing forward-looking information, fears about competitive information, as well as possible liabilities. What advice does EFRAG have on this issue?
I'm happy to start, and then I'm sure Tiered and Catalina maybe they can comment from the real perspective of a company. Well, first of all, disclaimer: I'm not talking on behalf of EFRAG here. Like this is my perspective, my view. So I would say that in general, there is a trend now to expect more forward-looking information in reports. It's also part of the scope of the CSRD. We've seen that, and in the context of our EFRAG recommendations, we're looking at what goals and targets and how credible those goals and targets are that companies are setting within which time frame. Then when it comes to potential liabilities, yes, that's part of the game. And that's also the reason why we're seeing, especially in some jurisdictions like the US, that the ownership of the ESG and sustainability piece is actually transitioning to legal counsel. But the reality is this, we were asking about more integration since the beginning. More integration means mandatory requirements, means new accounting rules, means new regulation, new potential liabilities. I think this is what integration looks like in the end. And when it comes to competitive information, Well, I always like to share this story. It was originally told by Bob Eccles, so it's not my own story, but essentially before the big stock market crisis in 1929, the Security Exchange Commission wasn't there. So essentially, there was no information required to be disclosed by companies that were listed. After the stock market crash, actually the Security Exchange Commission was established, and there were the first disclosure requirements for basic information, revenues, costs. And of course, the first reaction of companies to that was, we can't disclose that. It's competitive information. That argument, of course, doesn't hold anymore. The reality is that we need markets that are well functioning, and information is part of it. And this is my perspective. Then I guess when you get to the perspective of what real companies do and think, that may change. I don't know, Tjeerd or Catalina, if you have anything to share about it.
Well, I like the example, Donato. I hadn't heard it before, but I think it's great. And Cornish, thank you for asking the question, because it allows me to reflect on the EFRAG report and saying, and I wasn't part of the team, right? So Donato was part of the team. But what I like about the EFRAG report is it's not so much saying you should do this or that, but it's demonstrating some best practices. And that from an EFRAG team is really helpful. And one of the best practices, and this is relating to the question Cornish asked, is on the opportunities side. And actually, if you look at example 43, I'll highlight it for you. It's the example of ABN AMRO on our opportunities and risk table. And this was heavily challenged within the bank as well. Should we disclose this? Because it's not, it's not price sensitive, it's not competitive information to the sense that Donato just shared, but it is heavily debated. Let's call it that. And I think it's great that EFRAG is using this report just to share those best practices, because it gives other companies, including ABN AMRO, a sense of direction. Where should we be going? Also in terms of opportunities and risks. And I think that's a really powerful, that makes the report for me usable, actually. Yeah.
And there's a question here to that point, about it's the direction that we're going. So there is going to be the first set of legally mandatory sustainability reporting standards in the world. When will that be?
I don't know. Have they said? I think soon, right? I mean, I was hoping before the end of the year, but I think they've said now somewhere early next year. But don't wait for it. Just get going. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah, absolutely. Be prepared.
Be prepared.
Great. Well, I do appreciate that we've gone 5 minutes over. It looks like most people have stayed with us, so thank you for doing that. If you do have more questions for us that we haven't been able to answer, feel free to email us with those questions, and we'll do our best to answer those. But really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us, especially Tjeerd and Catalina. Congratulations on being recognized as best practice. If you haven't read the report, advise you to do that. And if you feel you want to learn a little bit more, again, we're happy to talk more about that. So have a good rest of the day, everybody, a good rest of the week, and speak to you soon.